Yeah, so I'm going to read a little bit about what I have done, and this will look like a bunch of claims to you because there is no time now to show what I have done. The second part of what I'm going to present today is actually a paper, and there you'll see some evidence for one claim that I'm making. So let me just read out and tell you what I did in the last 6 months of receiving the fellowship. So to formulate methodologically sound questions about women in the Dharma texts, it is imperative we first understand the genre of the Dharma texts. To this end, in chapter 1, I draw from understandings of Dharma hitherto, mainly using Paul Hacker and Horsch, and assess two key theories: the custom as basis for Dharma texts theory, and then which is proposed by Larry Weir, Wessler, and Oliville, and the Dharma texts as propagandists of elitist ideology theory, which is seen in Lubin 2012. These theories perceive a shift and discontinuity in the Dharma of the Vedas and the Dharma of the Dharma texts. So I offer a theorization of the Dharma texts by doing two things. One, establishing continuities between the Dharma of the Vedas and the Dharma of the Dharma texts, which I argue is erroneously perceived as shifting and viewed as separate based on semantic studies. And then I show why there is continuity between the two dharmas by suggesting that the Vedic sacrifice is a primordial act that teaches us how to act, and that it works on an understanding of rinas or debts, an emphasis on which can be found in the Dharma texts as well. Then I problematize the elitist ideology theory of the Dharma texts, and to do this, I argue that an explanatory theory of caste is lacking, and that there are critiques of Brahmins as of all castes within the Dharma texts, and several other genres of texts like the Mahabharata. I outline a theory of caste as based on purity, impurity derived from degrees of violence and non-violence in one's actions and thoughts, thus laying the groundwork on which to analyze the position of women in the Dharma texts in the chapters that follow. This theory was worked out earlier, not during the last 6 months. So I merely outline it in the writing that I have done. So basically, I theorize the genre of the Dharma texts as having a Dharma that combines the eternal Vedic principles with dynamic customs and practices. So this is what constitutes Dharma in the Dharma texts. And I argue that they cannot be read as elitist ideologies because they're coterminous with Tantra and epics, both genres that were devised to include the Stri and Shudras. So basically, I'm asking if Dharma Shastras arose with Tantra and with epics, whose main intention was to include Stri and Shudras, then how must we understand the Dharma Shastras? Why should we understand them as like the same agenda? So what I take from the discussion in chapter 1 to bear on the rest of my chapters is this: that gods and deities were the reference points of the Dharma texts, in combination with customs that sought to put Vedic principles into practice in the social realm. What emerges from this is that not all statements or declarations in the Dharma texts about the nature of women are independent, self-standing, empirically verifiable statements about women. Instead, their point of reference is an ideal heavenly deity or a Vedic myth. Then secondly, runas and the Vedic ritual are the overarching frameworks we need to understand in order to understand the kind of dharma that is there in the Dharma texts. And without this, we just might miss the point. So I argue the latter point about Stri Dharma in chapter 6, noting how women's duties or Stri Dharma was of utmost importance and equal to the duties of men, insofar as the fulfillment of duties promised spiritual progress and also contributed to cosmic balance. So,
because I want to emphasize this. I think this is a very important thing that Dr. Kannan has done. Sleep habit. And the way that she has constructed sleep habit is a very important argument and important baseline on which we can put all our further studies of women in the mathematics. Now maybe you can tell us about the specific chapter you want to talk about.
Sure. Okay, so then my last point there was again that as to how we must understand the Dharma texts if they were concurrent with Tantras and epics, which aimed to be, inclusive of Stris and Shudras. So here's a paper on Shakuntala, basically addressing the theme, the femininity theme of the conference. So I won't take too much time. Let me start.
You have 10 minutes.
10 minutes, okay. I'll speed read. In the cultural imagination of India, Shakuntala is probably etched as an innocent, trusting, giving, patient person who endures suffering without complaints. But some of this image must be credited to her portrayal by Kalidasa in Abhignana Shakuntalam, wherein the focus appears to be accentuating rasas and bringing out contrasts. Kalidasa introduces his own feminist twists, for instance, in Menaka's rescue of her daughter, but the Mahabharata's portrayal of Shakuntala showcases her scholarship, virtue, and grit. The specific focus of the Mahabharata portrayal is Shakuntala's ability to be a truth speaker and credible witness. I arrived at this reading after I began thinking through the Mahabharata as a Dharma Shastra text. In my research project on the position of women in the Dharma Shastras, I constantly bumped into questions about how we must regard the Mahabharata as a Dharma Shastra text based on the traditional claim that the Mahabharata is a Dharma Shastra. Bhishma's teachings to Yudhishthira are quite evidently lessons in Rajadharma, but was a similar teaching of Stri Dharma conveyed through the stories of women? If yes, what lessons were the characters of Draupadi, Madhavi, or Shakuntala teaching? Prima facie, each character was mentioning Stri Dharma or Sahadharma or Pativrata Dharma, but the tales themselves were engrossing enough to evade arriving at a lesson per se, until I began to consider the relationship between the Manusmriti and the Mahabharata, that is. As Hopkins notes, about 1/10 of the Mahabharata is from the Manusmriti. There are several commonalities between the texts. The Mahabharata even mentions Manu, the lawgiver, and cites from him, and scholars have dated the two texts closely. Contrary to the straightforward speech that Bhishma delivers to Yudhishthira on a variety of topics in Rajadharma, the women characters of Mahabharata each appear to illustrate only one important aspect of Stri Dharma, already explicated in the Manusmriti. Perhaps this is why Vyasa assures Ganesha that he was going to compose a convoluted text that required Ganesha to spend some amount of time to understand its full import. Once a comparative approach between the Mahabharata and Manusmriti seemed like a valid possibility, I arrived at reading female characters of the Mahabharata in the following way. The story of Draupadi shows how women must serve their husbands but are not slaves to them. They cannot own property of their own, but they are not the property of men. Women have their Stridhana. Women must be guarded by men ably because it is their duty, a failure of which can result in the harassment, their harassment, as happened to Draupadi. The story of Madhavi shows how daughters or putrikas too deliver their parents from hell, a point that Manu makes about women. So we might think that Manu has very negative views of women, but it looks like that's not the case actually when you look carefully. Madhavi also assists in fulfilling her father's obligations as king to give and never refuse to a Brahmin. If serving family members was the duty of women, Sri Dharma, then Madhavi fulfills this to the fullest extent. The story of Amba shows the downside of abducting princesses, a practice followed by Kshatriyas, justifiably ranked low in the kinds of marriage.
One minute, I again just interrupt. I want to ask the audience, are you familiar with the story of Madhuri? If not, then perhaps, she's a very interesting, complex, and complicated character. If not, then maybe you should just tell the story of Madhuri. So, you don't know the story, because she was a daughter of Yayati. And to fulfill what Yayati had to give as Dakshina, she, in a sense, she married 4 kings, bore them a son each, and then returned back to her father's house. After which, her father and brothers arranged a Swayamvar for her. Also remember that even after co-habitating with women and carrying each a child, she was deemed to be a princess who would be married with all the pomp and splendor that a princess deserves. But what did Madhuri do? She took the mala of the Swayamvar and put it into the forest, signifying that she would now become a sannyasi. One with nature, one with the forest. She became one who runs with the deer, so it is said. So in that context, you must take Sushumna's words. She begged her father to fulfill his kingly duties. After his death, he went to Nat, and he fell into the fires of Nat. And who were the people who saved him? It was the sons of Madhuri. The 4 sons of Madhuri, they gave up their punya after discussion with Madhuri. She also gave up her punya, and Yayati could escape from the fires of them. So in that context, you must take this story and what she is saying, that Madhuri is very, very central. And she has actually done all those things that we expect only sons to do. I think that is the point we were making.
Yeah. So Madhuri is kind of portrayed as this very mute person who does everything her father says, but that's actually not true. She's doing her duty. She's contributing because there are these rinas that these rinas are not just for Brahmins; they are for everybody. That's made clear in the Vedas. It's not explicitly stated that women must also do it, but the very existence of Stri Dharma shows that women had to do it, that serving husbands after marriage, but before that other family members, was the very duty that women had to perform in this world. And that already got them moksha. They didn't have to do anything else. That was already spiritual progress. So they were rewarded for it. It was not just free labor or something like that. And when they didn't do it, there were severe cosmic imbalances. So we see this in bhakti literature. A lot of bhaktas telling us that when women don't follow Sri Dharma, rains don't appear, crops fail, and so on and so forth. So it's very clear that we are contributing to this world. It's just that we are in a safe space and we are trying to, we are not, but Kshatriya women have gone out and fought in battlefields. We have seen that too. So across castes, we have seen women performing a variety of duties, and they were extremely important. So to continue, the story of Ambika and Ambalika demonstrates the downside of niyoga, a practice that was abolished in later times according to the Dharma texts, and so on. With multiple injunctions incorporated into a single story, the women of the Mahabharata are all believable characters, and Stri Dharma is not taught in a linear and unproblematic manner, but discussed in a variety of situations that made following it complicated. In Shakuntala's story, especially her courtroom arguments, Manu's injunctions on women being truth speakers and witnesses is addressed. But before we look at these arguments, let us see which other injunctions from Manu the Mahabharata captures. When Dushyanta proposes marriage, Shakuntala proposes that they wait for her father Kanva to return, demonstrating through that Brahma Vivaha, wherein fathers give away daughters as gifts, is the recommended type of marriage. But when Dushyanta suggests the Gandharva type of marriage, Shakuntala agrees on the condition that it is dharma. In doing so, she places the responsibility of truth-telling on Dushyanta. As a contractual form of marriage that is not a gift, Shakuntala is eligible to place a condition, and that she does by asking for their son to be the heir apparent. When Dushyanta agrees, she weds him. This instance already shows that Shakuntala, having grown up in Kanva's ashrama, is well versed in the Dharma Shastras. In my understanding of Dharma as derived from the Vedic ritual as proper give and take, one of the senses of Dharma is a proper transaction. To that end, Shakuntala ably manages to pull off a transaction all on her own. As a Kshatriya, Shakuntala would have chosen her groom in a Swayamvara under normal circumstances, something that Dushyanta too has suggested earlier when he says that she is independent when it comes to marriage. Yet, having grown up in a forest, Shakuntala's knowledge of the world is limited and textbookish. Hence, Kanva emphasizes that she is innocent of the ways of the world before sending her to meet Dushyanta. And this is a distinction that Manu invokes often, women who know the world and women who don't. For example, he first declares the general rule that women cannot conduct business transactions and then states the exception wherein if they have been exposed or trained in exposed to the world and trained in these matters, they can handle businesses. He concludes that if women can handle the responsibility, they can become heirs and managers of parental property. Similarly, Manu first declares that women must not give evidence in court. He denies them the ability to be witnesses, but then he introduces several caveats. For instance, in cases of violence, women should be considered credible witnesses, and so on. By showing that Shakuntala is innocent of the way of the world, ideally she cannot make for a good witness. But there is another clause that Manu mentions, which Vyasa brings into play, that of noble birth. This is Vyasa's way of educating us in the nuances of Dharma. Neither he nor Manu have the intent to simply declare women unfit witnesses. When in court, Dushyanta calls her a false ascetic. Shakuntala is not quiet but abuses him right back. When their dialogue dissolves into a he said, she said narrative, she invokes the same inner sense, the Antaratma or Sakshi, that Dushyanta had invoked to understand his feelings for her before proposing marriage. This inner sense is an invitation to discuss one of the crucial sources of Dharma in the Dharma texts, which is Atma Tushti. According to this source, a follower of Dharma can rely on his senses to guide him or her on occasion. Dushyanta had declared himself to be a man of self-control who does not desire women indiscriminately, yet had felt an unmistakable attraction towards Shakuntala. He infers from this that she too must be a Kshatriya. In the court, when Dushyanta refuses to acknowledge their marriage, Shakuntala declares that the sun, moon, the wind, the fire, the space, the earth, water, the heart, the controller of life and death, and so on, Dharma, they all know of a man's conduct. These are her witnesses. She's speaking back to Manu in some way, but also engaging with Manu. She then speaks of wifehood and motherhood. Describing wifehood in detail, she concludes, even in moments of anger, no man shall do ill to his wife. This is actually a Dharmashastric injunction. Men who abandon noble wives are liable to punishment. Women have enormous respect within the Grihastha. They are required for performing sacrifices and bearing children who enable the attainment of moksha or heaven. So Shakuntala is fighting her case by citing the Dharma Shastras, just like Draupadi. Becoming angry like Draupadi, she continues her appeals, but finally curses Dushyanta as well. She is not innocent anymore. When Dushyanta accuses her...
Will you continue now, please? Can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Will you conclude now, Sushumna?
Yeah. Okay. So basically, I point out a few more instances of how Shakuntala is declaring herself to be her own witness, that she doesn't need anybody else towards the end. And then a divine voice comes about and tells Dushyanta to honor her. And this is very interesting because Manu is always telling us where women are honored, there, the gods decide. So the references are very interesting. And then a very negative statement that Dushyanta has said, that women are liars, why should we trust them, is replaced in that Vani by a very positive statement that women in their goodness have no parallel. So then Dushyanta admits, and then the story wraps up. So I just want to conclude by reading a paragraph. I'm inclined to argue that the Mahabharata does not deviate from the Manusmriti at all. It shows us how to apply the Manusmriti. However, it's possible it extends Manu's injunctions by making different kinds of dharma enter into dialogue with one another, and possibly clarifies the meanings of Manu's injunctions and the subtle nature of dharma. An implication of the finding that the Mahabharata might be based on a bare bones version of the Manusmriti is that the Dharma Shastra texts no longer appear to be as conservative as often imagined. If the Mahabharata is viewed as at least possessing strong female characters who exercise choice, then by implication of its close following of the Manusmriti too should be read as a pro-women text. The only difference between them is that one is a pedagogical text, the other is an epic with well-rounded characters. In other words, how does a reading of the Mahabharata as a Dharma Shastra reflect back upon the Manusmriti? Quite positively. It changes the negative stereotype of the Manusmriti as a text designed to suppress women, or as a contradictory text with little sense, and so on. To conclude, Shakuntala is sacrificing, enduring, empathetic, and nurturing, but not without a fight in her. She speaks truth even when it's uncomfortable to do so. She's not without virtue. And if the women of the Mahabharata are this way, then the text forces us to radically alter our attribution to femininity to them, or alter our very understanding of femininity within Hinduism itself. Thus, the feminine in Hinduism is inclusive of the feminist, not opposed or contrary to it.
Thank you. Thank you.